For today's topics, we are going to start thinking about forms of governance, which are unitary versus federal states, and then starting our discussion about devolution, but devolution is also going to spill over into Friday's topics as well. Okay, so the forms of governance, really for this section, you just need to understand the difference between a federal versus a unitary state. And so we're going to talk about that. This can be sometimes a confusing question. This can be a confusing concept, but it is actually pretty simple. And we're actually seeing some really good examples of it right now with federal versus unitary and the response to the coronavirus. So to start off with our definition, federal state is where power is broken up between different levels and purposes of government. It oftentimes tries to account for differences in ethnicity or varying populations, especially in countries that are extremely diverse, and especially in countries that are extremely large, because you have different physical geographies, you have different groups of people that develop regionally. A unitary government is where power is held only at one level, which is the central government level. Now, just to be clear, both federal and unitary governments can both be democracies. People can vote on their leaders or people can vote on laws. However, unitary states, if we do have an authoritarian government, it's much more likely to be a unitary state. All right, so to get this a little bit more detail, when we think about a unitary state, so now going back to unitary state, we have a central government, and that central government makes the rules and the laws for the entire country. Some of the advantages of this is that it can create cohesiveness. Some of the disadvantages of this would be that one law or one government is making rules and laws for the entire country. And if we have regions of that government that don't see themselves as needing the same things or wanting the same things as the rest of the country, it doesn't necessarily hear those voices as strongly. The federal government is going to be where power is shared between the central government. So the central government in Washington, D.C., for example, in the United States, makes laws that apply to the entire country. But then the regional governments, which in our case are our state level governments, make laws that apply just to our state. And so there's some sharing of powers. So the central government makes powers, the regional governments make powers, but some of them can overlap. So for example, the state level government and the central government both have the power to collect taxes. And so, but then the central government has some jurisdiction over things like trade and war and commerce and money, whereas regional powers get to determine how elections are run, marriages, so on and so forth. This is more likely to recognize the diversity of the state, or of the state, meaning the country, but it is also going to, create maybe a little bit less cohesion, as you might see in a unitary government. So we talked about two different countries as case studies, and so I want to be clear. So Nigeria will be an example of a federal state. They have 36 states. Each state chooses their own judicial system. And that judicial system then only applies to the state. And so here you see a map of Nigeria split into the northern and southern Nigeria, whereas the northern states all their judicial system is all based on Sharia law, which is the kind of the fundamentalist Islamic law. And the northerners seek to expand. That goes into kind of some of the terrorist aspects of that. However, this piece right here is not like evidence of a federal system. But you see that they each get to make laws that apply only to their states. In France, you'll notice that in France, they do have internal boundaries. So a unitary government still has most of the time internal boundaries. So they might have departments as in France, they might have provinces as in China, but those individual departments, they'll have a representative. So they have a representative that they send to the central government. That representative is still working for the people of the region. They still are trying to bring the concerns and the wants and the needs of their people to the central government. But then at the central government level, they vote on laws And then those representatives then go back to their region as their department, and they carry out those laws. So the regional voices might still get heard. However, the laws that get made apply to everyone. And so maybe if your region has like a very loud voice or overrepresentation in the government, you might get more of what you want. So if you think about like a unitary government as being in the United States, for example, if we were a unitary government, which we're not because we have that state level government, but if we were a unitary government, we would still have our senators, our Minnesota senators, we would still have our Minnesota representatives because those are the people that go to Washington, D.C. They vote on the laws that apply to the entire nation. So we'd still get those representatives. We just wouldn't have a governor that makes laws, or we wouldn't have a Minnesota Senate and a Minnesota House of Representatives that make laws for just Minnesota. So one thing I was talking about in the webinar yesterday was how we're seeing this kind of play out a little bit with our response to the coronavirus. And so because we have this federal system, a lot of the shutdowns, the lockdowns, the decisions that are getting made about the stay-at-home orders are all coming from individual states. And every state is applying those laws in different ways. So the central government, although they are suggesting certain things, what a lot of the laws, or most of the laws, are all getting done at the state level. And so, with the state of Minnesota that has a stay-at-home order until May 4th at this point, another state might be ready to lift their stay-at-home order, or another state might be extending their stay-at-home order. And so it's kind of this patchwork of different laws, which can be positive if you feel like there's differences between states. So for example, New York has been hit a lot harder than other parts of the country. So maybe they need something different than Wyoming does. But if you're looking for a cohesive response to the coronavirus at a national level, then the unitary government is going to be a lot more apt to be able to carry that out. Okay. So topic 4.8 is devolution and the factors of devolution. And so devolution now is the movement of power from the central government to those regional governments. And so we have the central government. We have power that the central government holds. Anytime power is shifted away from the central government towards the regional government, that's devolution. So there's many ways devolution happens. Here are some examples. We could have a country that moves towards more of a federal system. Let's say they're a unitary state and they decide that they're going to implement they're going to become a federal state, they're going to implement a federal system. That's devolution. If you have a region of your country that is granted the ability to make some rules for themselves, or they demand more power, they demand more autonomy, and they get some of that autonomy. So in many unitary states, there are regions of that country that even they're autonomous, that they are not, or they're semi-autonomous, where they do have some power, even though it still is a unitary state. They have that particular region has some power to make decisions on their own. Or you have these full-on independence movements and secession movements. And so we're going to talk about the cause of the devolution today. Tomorrow we're going to talk a little bit more about some of those regions that maybe fall into these different categories. Okay, so the defining devolution, define devolutionary factors. So what factors lead to devolution? Remember, factors are a cause or something that is contributing to whatever we're talking about. You might see that word factor in the AP exam, so just make sure that you understand that a factor is something that leads to or contributes to something else, kind of like a cause. And so here are the different categories that the AP curriculum lists out. Physical geography, so anytime you have a region that is physically separated from the rest of the country, even like things like islands or regions that are separated by geographic factors like mountain ranges or whatever, you are going to have more likely that that region is going to see themselves as separate. Ethnic separatism, so anytime that you have different groups, national groups that really see themselves as separate from the rest of the country, they might practice a different religion, or they might have a different language, or they just see themselves as ethnically different. That's a factor that can lead to devolution. ethnic cleansing, which is the mass expulsion or killing of members of an unwanted ethnic or religious group in a society. So a region that is experiencing that obviously would have devolution or can lead to independence movements. Terrorism, this one we didn't talk too much about during class, but a lot of times devolutionary movements or regions that see themselves as separate will have groups, particular groups, not the entire region, have groups that see themselves as carrying out maybe the independence movement of the region through terrorist methods. And so we're going to see some examples of that in the next slide. Economic and social problems. So a region has some economic problems or economic benefits. So they see themselves as economically secure and they want to split away from the rest of the country. And then irredentism. This is when one nation, so let's say your country here, you have a country and part of your national group spills over into a neighboring state, and that state, actually the original state, your nation state, wants to reunite you with the rest of the territory. An example of this was when Nazi Germany invaded Austria prior to World War II, because the many Austrians are German-speaking people, and many consider themselves German people. They said, "Oh, we're just, annexing Austria in order to take them back in to our home country." Yeah. Okay. And then also, this is going to come up tomorrow as well, but technology can lead to devolution. So technology can bring people together and lead to these movements. Going back to my map here, these are different regions that have, so this is different regions within Europe that have faced devolution. So this is the Soviet Union, and these are the satellite nations. We call these satellite nations that were under Soviet Union rule, even though they were kind of different regions. But then after the fall of the Soviet Union, they became independent countries, so that's devolution. We have the Czechoslovakia here, which broke into the Czech Republic and Slovakia. And then we have Yugoslavia, which is now a whole bunch of different countries, which is a great example of devolution, so on and so forth. And then on this map, we have kind of the opposite of devolution, where we had East Germany and West Germany that reunited after the fall of communism. Okay, so regions within Europe that are facing some devolutionary pressures: Scotland, Wales, Catalonia. We talked about the Basque region, different regions. This is obviously just within Europe, and we see a lot of other examples throughout the world. So physical geography, here's some examples: deserts, large bodies of water, India and the Pakistan region. So this map is of the Kashmir region, which is being fought over between India and Pakistan, but also people within it might see themselves as separate from either of those countries. Ethno-linguistic divisions, so Yugoslavia and Czechoslovakia, the Basque and the Catalonians, or the Catalans, see themselves as ethnically, linguistically different and wanting to separate or break apart as in Yugoslavia along those ethnic lines. Terrorism, so within the Basque country in Spain, there's a separatist group that uses violence and terrorism to work for their means. There's other examples of that. For example, in northern Nigeria, there's examples of that in Kashmir. There's examples of that in the Uyghur population. The Chinese government has accused the Uyghur population in Xinjiang of using violence and terrorism to separate themselves from China. So oftentimes that can be an aspect of devolution. Economic factors and control of resources. Locals want more control, but government wants to use them. So Scotland, one of the reasons why the Scottish people see themselves as ethnically diverse, linguistically diverse, but they also have a lot of oil. And so one of the pushes, even though Scotland voted against their independence, one of the pushes in Scotland was that, we can be economically secure because we have a bunch of oil. Why would we want to stay with Britain? So that was a reason or a movement towards Scottish independence. Although I don't think this is going to happen anytime soon. We've talked about how California could really be very self-sufficient on its own. And so, maybe eventually a separatist movement of the state of California will become a thing due to economic factors. Okay. All right, so that was a lot today, and there's going to be a lot tomorrow. And then, but yeah, we have after this week, we have one more unit topic, and that's agriculture next week. And then we'll move on to some test taking strategy. All right, have a good Thursday.